Before we get into the pursuit of happiness, I want to say one more word about the check presentation last Sunday. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. And we had no idea when we set the date. We just set the date around when Con was available, and January 19th was the first date he was available. Had no idea when we set that would be a day before the worst cold snap of the winter. Like, winter finally arrived in Columbia last Sunday, and we had 3 days where the temperatures did not get above freezing. On Monday, I spent an hour and a half outside at the courthouse at the Martin Luther King March, and I was freezing. I mean, I had coat and scarf and hat, and I was just standing there shaking. And what was going through my mind was, I can't imagine being homeless in a situation like this. I can't imagine having to sleep in my car or being in a place where I didn't have heat at a time like that. And while I was thinking that, Con was at that same march. He was talking to the chief of police, and they set up an arrangement to where Crossroads to Home secured several hotel rooms. So the next 3 days, if the police ran across anybody that was sleeping in the Walmart parking lot or outside or anything like that, they could take them to the hotel. Crossroads to Home had already paid for the hotel rooms, and then they could also give them a voucher for a Waffle House, which was nearby. So what I'm telling you is, the money that you gave them last Sunday was immediately put to work. I just talked to Con at Rotary, and he said, I just helped a family, a mother and father with 9 children, find shelter for tonight. And so that money's immediately being put to work, and I just want to thank you one more time for your generosity in giving to that, to the year-end giving and the presentation we made at Crossroads to Home. It was so fun to do that. But one of our values is radical generosity. That's one of our core values at Murray Hills. And you helped us do that by the radical generosity you practiced on December 15th, and now that's spilling over into more acts of generosity. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I can't really emphasize it enough, is the reason we were able to do things like that, the reason we're able to give $65,000 to Crossroads to Home, and I haven't even told the folks from Belize what they've got coming. The reason we're able to do it is because of the regular, consistent giving that happens every Sunday here. So we've been talking about automated giving the entire month of January, and I want to say thank you to those of you that have signed up for automated giving, or you've set up a giving schedule on Simple Give. I know several of you have done that this month, and we really appreciate it. It gives us the freedom to do some creative giving at other times throughout the year. Several of you are already on automated giving. I want to say thank you for being faithful and being a part of that, and some of you increased your amounts in the month of January. Thank you for that. And then some of you have been thinking about it, but just not quite sure if it's something you want to do. I want to encourage you to do it. You can turn in a voided check and tell us an amount. That sets up the weekly draft. You can go to murrayhills.com/give and follow the instructions to set up a giving schedule on Simple Give. You can download the app through the App Store on your smartphone, and that's the easiest way to do it. You just set up a giving schedule that way. But that automated giving results in special giving at different times throughout the year. And so that's why we can do Be the Sermon. That's why we can give away our Easter offering, and we're going to give away our Easter offering again this year. It's why we're able to surprise Crossroads to Home, and the BB Church will be surprising them soon with the gift to Belize. So just be thinking about that. I know we've been hammering that pretty hard the month of January, and February's coming, so we'll get quiet, stop talking about it, but it's so important for us as a church, because it allows us to do what we're called to do as a church, and that's to give back to our community. So let's talk about happiness. We're going to wrap up the Pursuit of Happiness series today, and it's a series that was based upon the most unlikely of books. This is probably the only sermon series in America that's based upon the book Sapiens, because it's written by a guy that's not exactly friendly to Christianity in the book, but he wrote something, the second to last chapter of the book, that was just really profound, and it became the inspiration for this entire series. And what he was talking about was a study that psychologists did that revealed true happiness, or lasting happiness, doesn't really come from the things we think it comes from. We tend to think at this time of year especially, we're pursuing health and we're pursuing wealth and success and all that. He says that has a temporary effect on our happiness. Our happiness might spike, or it might dip in response to our health or wealth, but it doesn't last. What really has a lasting impact on happiness is our participation in family or community. That makes the biggest difference. It all comes back to relationships, family and community. And that's whether we're talking about our biological family or our chosen family or our faith family. That makes the biggest impact on our happiness. Then last week, we talked about how as members of a community, we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility in community, especially the affluent members of the community, of which pretty much all of us are. We have a responsibility to care for the weak and the vulnerable, or what Jesus called the least of these in our community. So we talked about giving last Sunday and serving others, and the idea that Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. So the pathway to happiness, if you put together the last 3 weeks, the pathway to happiness is not more money, it's not better health. The pathway to happiness is community, serving others, and giving back. And that's really what it all comes down to. Now, what I wanted to do today is I want to kind of flip the switch just a little bit. And rather than talking about how to find happiness, what I'd like to talk about is the enemy of happiness. What keeps us from finding happiness? What is it that competes with us when it comes to this subject right here? And so to do that, we're going to re-enter the mind of Harari. I want to read you a couple of paragraphs out of his book, and he's a pretty deep thinker, so you got to put on a thinking cap for just a little bit here. And to set it up, I want to remind you of the parable he tells. Right before this section right here, he tells the parable of Lucy and Luke. Okay, so Lucy and Luke are middle-class twins, and they go take a well-being study at a psychologist's office. They're asked to rate their levels of happiness. On the way home from the study, Lucy has a car accident, and she's got broken bones and a permanently lame leg. And then right when they're clearing the wreckage from the accident, her brother Luke calls, and he's just won $10 million in the lottery. So 2 years later, she'll be limping, and he'll be a lot richer. But when they go for a follow-up study, they're likely to rate their level of happiness at the same place they did the morning of that fateful day. And Harari says this is why. Think about this. The most important finding of all is that happiness does not really depend on the objective conditions of wealth or health, or even community. Rather, it depends on the correlation between objective conditions and subjective expectations. Read that one more time. Happiness depends on the correlation between objective conditions and subjective expectations. In other words, if you want an ox cart and you get an ox cart, then you're content. The conditions met your expectations. If you want a brand new Ferrari and only get a secondhand Fiat, then you feel deprived because the conditions did not meet your expectations. And this is why winning the lottery over time has the same impact on people's happiness as a debilitating car accident. When things improve, expectations balloon. And so consequently, even dramatic improvements in conditions can leave us dissatisfied. When things deteriorate, expectations shrink. And consequently, even a severe illness might leave you pretty much as happy as you were before. And then Harari concludes with this. You might say, we didn't need a bunch of psychologists and their questionnaires to discover this. Prophets, poets, and philosophers realized thousands of years ago that being satisfied with what you already have is far more important than getting more of what you want. Still, it's nice when modern research, bolstered by lots of numbers and chart, reaches the same conclusions that the ancients did. Now, what is he saying there? When Harari says prophets, poets, and philosophers realized thousands of years ago, exactly what prophets, poets, and philosophers do you think he's talking about? Possibly the ones that wrote some of these books right here. Exactly what we looked at in the book of Ecclesiastes and in other places here. And what does he mean when he uses the word, or he talks about being satisfied with what we've already had? What's he talking about there? when he says that, we should learn to be satisfied with what we have rather of wanting more of what we don't have. What's that word called? What is the biblical word for that's what? Can you think of one? The Greeks called it autarkes. Autarkes was translated into English as the word content. It means to be satisfied with what one has regardless of external circumstances. And it's really the true source of happiness. Happiness comes down to our levels of contentment. And that's a word, that autarkes is a word that's only used one time in the New Testament, and it's used by the Apostle Paul in the closing of his letter to the Philippian church. That's Philippians chapter 4, verse 10. If you got a Bible, go ahead and open that up with me and find that. Or if you got a phone with you, you can find it on your phone on the Bible app. But look at chapter 4, verse 10. Here's what Paul says. I rejoiced greatly that the Lord at last renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to do it. So what he's doing right here is he's thanking the Philippian church for a financial gift that they had given him. They took up a special collection, and they had given it to Paul to support his ministry. And so he's saying, I'm thankful for that. Thank you. Just like I thanked you for the year-end giving contribution. He's just saying, hey, thanks for the contribution. I really appreciate that. Verse 11, I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. And I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. I can do all of this through him who gives me strength. Now, we're familiar with this passage primarily because of verse 13, which is usually translated, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. That's why we know this passage, because we've seen sports stars write that on their, the eye black, and we've seen, gyms, they put it in the floor of the gym and all that kind of stuff. We're primarily familiar with Philippians 4 because of sports, but that's not at all what Paul's talking about. This is not talking about success on the athletic field. It's not talking about success in the workplace. It's not even talking about success in the family. It's talking about contentment. Verse 13, if you want to read it literally, would say this: I can be content regardless of the circumstances through Christ who gives me strength. That's what Paul said. Paul's saying, the source of my contentment doesn't come from me, and it doesn't even come from your contribution. The source of my contentment comes from Christ. And I've learned how to practice this regardless of external circumstances, whether things are going good or things are going bad, whether I got a lot or I got a little. I've learned to be content in any of those situations. And it reminds me of what he says a couple of books earlier, his letter to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He says kind of the same thing. Now, he doesn't use the word content. That word is only used in Philippians 4. But it's very similar language he uses, and this is in chapter 12, starting in verse 7. He says, therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. And 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. Now, there's a lot of really powerful truths in both of those texts right there. Philippians 4, you might want to mark that. If we're talking happiness, Philippians 4 might be a place you want to camp out. Now, there's a lot of really powerful truths in both of these passages that are largely ignored today. Like, we don't even think of happiness in the same way. We think of happiness as feeling good. To be happy is to feel good. Happiness is warm, fuzzy feelings. Happiness is like, I don't know, puppies and rainbows or whatever. I mean, happiness is moments of unending peace and tranquility. Happiness is having nothing ever go wrong in your life. And the Bible never describes happiness in that way. Certainly doesn't describe contentment in that way. I mean, look at what Paul's talking about here in 2 Corinthians 12. He's talking about negative things. I mean, he's talking about being tormented by Satan. He's talking about the thorn in his flesh and pleading with God to take it away from him. Yet he says, my grace, God says, my grace is sufficient for you. Paul is talking about his weakness and saying, I've learned to be content in weakness because the grace of God is sufficient for me. And God's power is made perfect in my weakness. So I'll boast all the more about my weaknesses, because when I boast about my weaknesses, he is lifted up and he is made strong. Now that makes sense. We understand, somebody saying, I'm content even though things aren't going good, or I'm happy even though things aren't going good. But flip back to Philippians and notice what he says here. I don't know that I've ever really caught this before, but I was just, for some reason, it jumped off the page at me this week. In Philippians, he says, I've learned to be content regardless of the circumstances. And then he says, whether things are good or things are bad. Well, he actually says, whether living in plenty or living in want, whether well-fed or hungry. It's like, okay, I get what you mean. Like, I've learned to be content even though I'm hungry. I've learned to be content even though I don't have everything I need. Okay, that makes sense. What does he mean by I've learned to be content even though I'm well fed? Or I've learned to be content even though I have plenty? How does that work? How could you not be content if you're well fed and wealthy and healthy and have all the desires of your heart? Is it really possible to be discontented with success? And the answer is yeah, of course it is. It happens all the time. America's a land of discontentment, and yet we have incredible amounts of wealth and success and progress. We've been talking that all throughout the series. Things are better than they've ever been before, and yet we still ain't happy. There's a YouTube video out there. I've referenced it several times before. It's one of my favorite YouTube clips, and I can't show it to you because a word's bleeped out, and some people would freak out about that if I showed that at church. But you can go watch it. Just Google it. It's called "Everything is Amazing and Nobody's Happy." And what he's talking about several examples there, but the example I like was the example of flight. And he's like, just think what we can do now. We can go from one part of the country to the other part of the country, all the way across, from Nashville to L.A., in under 4 hours. That trip used to take 2 weeks, and people would die on the way. Like take Oregon Trail, not the actual trail, the computer game, the dysentery and all that. But you think about that. We can now go in 10 hours. I could be halfway around the world because of the miracle of flight. And we're 40,000 feet in the air. Like, if you think about this, the next time you fly. You're 40,000 feet in the air in a metal tube going 500 miles an hour. And what are we worried about? Our seat won't recline. the headphones won't work. I can't watch my movie because my headphones aren't working. Why can't I watch my movie? We're flying through the sky and we're worried about our movie won't work, or the Wi-Fi won't work, or it's really hot in here. Or you just think it's kind of crazy to think about it. But the reason is exactly what Harari's saying. Our expectations evolve. When airplanes first came out, we were just happy that they got us from this point to this point without crashing. But now we expect them to have Wi-Fi and movies and drinks and food and all. Our expectations evolved with when things improved. Our expectations evolved. It's just like cars. We've talked about that too. I was thinking about that. Like we were happy used to be if a car just got us point A to point B. I'm happy about that. And then they put radios in cars. And then we not only wanted to go from point A to point B, but we wanted to have music along the way. And we got frustrated if the station kind of started losing signal or the antenna wasn't picking up things like it was supposed to. And so then we got tapes. But then, of course, we got mad if the player ate our tape. You remember pulling those tapes out? Kids don't even know what we're talking about now, but pulling the tape out of there if the player ate it. Or then we got CDs. But then, of course, if the CD skipped and the player's not working right and all that kind of stuff, well, now we got Bluetooth and we just listen to it on our phones. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have yelled at your car because it won't obey your Bluetooth commands? Or how many of you have yelled at Siri because she doesn't understand you, because she doesn't understand English? That's just one of her flaws. But before at my car, I've complained because I'll say Bluetooth audio and it'll say, please say a command. Or, it can't. I'm yelling at my car like, this piece of junk. Why won't it listen to me? Why can't it obey my commands? You think it's nuts, isn't it, to think about it? And the reason it's like that is because our expectations evolved. And so let me share another quote. I closed my book and I shouldn't have. Another quote from Harari real quick. Look at this. If happiness is determined by expectations, then two pillars of our society, mass media and the advertising industry, may unwittingly be depleting the globe's reservoirs of contentment. If happiness is determined by expectations, then mass media and the advertising industry are quickly depleting our reservoir of contentment. Here's the way he explains it. Let's say 5,000 years ago, you were an 18-year-old kid living in a village. You might have thought you were pretty good looking because you would have been comparing yourself to 50, 60 other people living in the village. And most of them were old or scarred or wrinkled or still kids. So you're just comparing yourself to just a few other guys of your age, and you think, in comparison to these guys, I'm a pretty good looking guy. In today's society, it doesn't work that way anymore, right? Even if all the rest of the guys around you are ugly, you're still likely to feel inadequate because you don't compare yourself to the guys around you. You compare yourself to Tom Brady or Brad Pitt or whoever it is that women think look good these days. I mean, you're comparing yourself to superstar athletes and super famous people. I mean, we're comparing ourselves to those people, and that's the standard of beauty, or that's the standard of success. Like with me with preaching, think about this. People used to be, you would compare the preacher to the preacher down the street. People don't compare me to the preacher down the street anymore. They compare me to Andy Stanley or or Louis Giglio or Beth Moore. Why can't Russ preach more like Andy Stanley? I wish he could. Andy Stanley's one of the best preachers in the world. But that's who I get compared to. But people don't compare Scott to the worship leader at the church they used to attend. He's compared to Hillsong United and Elevation Worship and all of these incredible worship leaders. Why can't our worship band play more music like that? I mean, it's just crazy if you think about it, what mass media has done, and it's created totally unrealistic expectations and standards, and we start to feel unhappy if we don't measure up to the best in the world. I mean, I say all the time, I say this, and you think about it, it's so true. Likes and dislikes used to be a subjective thing. Like when I was growing up, how did you know if somebody liked you or not? Maybe they told you. Maybe they wrote a note to you, but it was rare. You really didn't know how popular you were. And if you were to share something of yourself or share a pic, you really didn't know if anybody liked that or not. But today, there's an objective measurement of popularity, an objective measurement of how good that picture was, or how good that quote was you shared, or that thought you shared. You can look, see how many likes you got, see how many follows, see how many people. You think about how that changes the comparison game, because then I can look at my likes and followers and friends and all that and compare them not to other people's likes, followers, and friends, but to the super famous and the super wealthy and the superstars. I compare it to their likes and follows. And I'm always inadequate when I do that. I mean, Instagram's even figuring this out. Instagram's going to do away with letting people see the number of likes. They're experimenting with this right now. And on our Dream 514 account, we're one of the accounts they're experimenting on right now. We just discovered this. So they started it in Australia and Canada, and it'll show, you post your picture, but it won't show how many people liked it. And it won't show how many followers you got. You can see that information, but the people around you can't see that information. And I applaud Instagram for doing it, because they're figuring out that this comparison game is hurting our happiness. It's hurting our ability to experience contentment. I don't know who said it or where I read it, or I'd give them credit. But there's no win in comparison. So stop. If you want to experience happiness, you're going to have to stop comparing yourself to other people, especially people you don't even know. And you're comparing yourself to this brief moment in time in their life that they've posted on their social media account. And you have no idea if that's what their life is like all the rest of the hours of the day. You have no idea if that's even what they look like. because they've carefully chosen just the right picture and the right image and the right sentiment to share with you. So stop comparing yourself to them. It's an impossible standard. Stop counting your followers. Stop counting your likes and dislikes. Stop comparing yourselves to impossible standards of beauty, success, and wealth, because there's no win in comparison. Learn to be content. God's grace is sufficient for you. You are enough on your own. Trust who you are in Christ. Lean on His strengths. Be content with who you are.
All right.